what we went over last week. You have, the settlement of kind of Eastern Europe after the end of the last ice age, glaciers retreat. You have various groups move in, Indo-European conquests. They fragment. One of these fragmentary groups is the Balto-Slavs. The Slavs remain in kind of their original homeland in northern Ukraine and modern-day Belarus. They have the Iranian steppe tribes, later the Turkic steppe tribes that kind of dominate the very flat steppe to the south. So the Slavs are restricted for most of their prehistory to that kind of swamp and forest steppe contact region. Eventually, in the migration period, the Volkerwanderung, the fall of Rome, that whole era, you go and you see the first Turkic and Mongol tribes arrive. They kind of clear out the area. You have the large Slavic migrations. The Slavs fragment into three main groups: the Western Slavs, which are the Poles, the Czechs; the South Slavs, the Bulgarians, the Slovenes; and the East Slavs, who we're mostly concerned with here, which are the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Belarusians. We also went over the foundation of the Rus, who were this tiny class of Viking and Finnish originating people who kind of brought together these Slavic tribes and unified them in some kind of murky circumstances. The history that we have for the foundation of Rus has been, almost certainly not true. There's a lot of fabrications going on. Certain people who claim they were the descendants of certain people who we know from DNA were not. But nonetheless, there were kind of those Rus states that were the predecessors of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. They fragment in the 11th and 12th centuries. So by the 13th century, they're split into a number of different principalities, and then the Mongols come. And that's where we're starting off today, the Mongols. So the Mongols, they are a people. They live in Mongolia, to the north of China and to the south of Russia. They speak their own unique language. It's very distantly related to the Turkic, Japanese, and Korean languages, as well as Tungusic, of which the Manchu is one branch. They kind of form from these cataclysmic wars following the fall of the Xiongnu. The first group of Mongols to kind of storm into the world stage is the Avars, who we, have some DNA from in what's nowadays modern-day Hungary. The Mongols were still around, ruling Mongolia, and of course you have Genghis Khan, who in the early 13th century goes and conquers just this huge amount of territory. The steppe tribes were, in the steppe tribes, those are the nomadic peoples. They were based around kind of cattle pastoralism. They would herd. They're basically cowboys, like what you have in the American West. That lifestyle was very similar, except they were far, far more militarized. They were not, kind of taxpayers to an agricultural state. They were at some points, but in the Mongol case, they weren't. So you have these kind of pastoral steppe tribes. They finally get unified. And even though their population was very small, even today, I think there's only about 3 million people in Mongolia. They can mobilize a much, much larger fraction of their population than an agricultural state. For an agricultural state, even mobilizing 1% to 2% of the population would be incredible, and a lot of times it was well under that. The Teutonic Order, for instance, which is nowadays based out of Kaliningrad Oblast in Russia, only had about 800 knights at any given point, and the largest armies they could raise were maybe 15,000 men, and that was for which they just did once in their entire 300-year period, roughly 300-year period of state sovereignty, out of a population of about 400,000 people. So even 3% would have been unheard of, and that was known as one of the greatest battles in the Middle Ages. Mostly the agricultural states mobilized a far smaller portion of their population, less than 1%. The steppe tribes, they could mobilize 20, 30, 40% of their population, depending on whose sources you want to trust. So the Mongols, could put 200 to 400,000 men in the field, which, just dwarfed everyone else. The states of Eastern Europe at the time probably had a population maybe of 20 million, if you're counting the Rus, the Poles, and the Hungarians were also a major power. They just could not put up a force to stand up to the Mongols, who committed maybe 20 to 40,000 men during their invasions of Europe. The other thing, too, is that the heavily infantry-based armies of the Eastern European states weren't a match for kind of the Mongol light cavalry and horse archers who could go. They're very intelligent leadership, very capable. They could launch attacks and then retreat, have the formations of the kind of Eastern European states break up, and then wheel back around and attack them with a disciplined assault. So just with the tactics, the mass mobilization the Mongols had, none of these states really could stand against them in this initial wave of conquests in the 13th century. The fragmented Rus states, they did try to put up a fight. Some of them did, but ultimately they pretty much all failed, at least in the initial invasions. The city of Kiev, which had already been sacked pretty brutally twice in the previous 80 years, during kind of the fighting between the different Rus princes, was just totally destroyed. There's a memoir of a guy who's passing down the Dnieper River about 30 years after the Mongols sacked it, and it's just kind of like a handful of people who are left like farming in the ruins of this city that once had 40,000 people in it, which was very, very large by medieval times. I don't think London hit that point until the 15th century. Although, of course, England had its own unique issues going on in the 12th and 13th centuries. So as a result, you have kind of like a consolidation of the Rus states as the Mongols take over. They want to go, and they're not particularly interested in Russia. It's a relatively poor region compared to the other territories they have. They're interested in pasture lands for their horses. They're interested in China, which has great artisans that can give them all sorts of goods. And most importantly, they're interested in controlling the land trade route across the Great Eurasian Steppe, which they do. Later on in the 14th century, you actually see the Italian city-states go and they'll establish trading posts in the Crimea as well as the Sea of Azov to go take their goods from Italy, and they'll trade with the Mongols there for goods they bring all the way from China and Central Asia. So that's kind of the Mongol aim. They go and have some people who kind of oversee the Rus states, and they differ in different areas. So kind of the Great Steppe region, Kiev, that's all destroyed. The main two successors, that matter, I should say, are the Principality of Vladimir Suzdal and the Principality of Galicia-Volhynia. And Galicia-Volhynia is based out of what's nowadays Western Ukraine and the extreme southeast of modern Poland. It descended from a unique line of kind of the original Rus princes, going back to the late 11th century. And they had all sorts of fights. There were, some splintering. They had reunification finally under a leader, and but overall it was a very different kind of historical development than what you see in kind of the core of modern Russia, the area called the Golden Ring around Moscow, which is all these cities which, maybe like a 250 kilometer radius from what's nowadays Moscow. So the cities, they were based out of Moscow. They were more, they had all this extra land, but it was very marginal. It was forest land. You couldn't grow a lot of crops there. They had to focus on things like rye that you could get 2 harvests out of, because you could sow one in the fall and then harvest it in the spring, and then, sow another one in the spring and then harvest it in the fall. But rye just isn't, it's more robust than other crops, but it still doesn't give you as many calories or nutrients as other crops do. Basically farming in the north is hard. They relied heavily on pigs and all sorts of other stuff. Galicia-Volhynia is very different. It's considerably to the south of Moscow, better climate, and most importantly, it has access to 3 different river basins, or 4 even, if you want to cross over the mountains. So most trade back then was not done by land, it was done by sea, or I should say long distance trade. Much, much cheaper, much, much more energy efficient to just load your stuff onto a barge or a boat, sail it down a river. If there's like a rapid or something you can't cross, you just unload the goods, get on land. A lot of times there would have been like a fort or a city that you pay tax to stay there and be safe from bandits. And then you just kind of walk your boat down to the next place and then sail down that part of the river, or you could just sell your goods in that city and then let someone else take those goods to the next kind of trade post. So for Galicia-Volhynia, all the way over in western Ukraine, they go and they have access to the Dnieper River, which is the kind of center of Ukraine. They can sail all the way down to the Black Sea, go to the Caucasus, they can go to Constantinople, sail to Egypt, the Levant, Italy, anywhere. And of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. They had to worry about the winds, the weather, all sorts of stuff. But they did have access to the Mediterranean through that route. You also had the southern Bug River, which also flows into the Black Sea. Same thing. You can get to the Constantinople and the wealth of Greece and the Byzantine Empire. Dniester River, same thing. Sail into the Black Sea. But they also had the access to the Vistula River, which was very, very valuable. You can sail all the way up to the Baltic, connect with Germany, the Low Countries, Denmark, Sweden, and kind of the wealth of Poland. And that was one of the things that, the Teutonic Knights had control over. They controlled the access of the Vistula River into the Baltic Sea. So that made them very, very wealthy and also incurred the envy of the Poles, who, now that the German Teutonic Knights had cleared that area out of their, fanatical pagan Lithuanian and Baltic enemies, now wanted it for their own Polish reasons. Because it was a very, very wealthy city and was important even in World War II, the whole kind of control of the Vistula was one thing that Poland was unable to concede to the Germans. River trade was a big deal then, and it's still a big deal now. So you have access to all those rivers in kind of Galicia-Volhynia. You also have development of the salt trade. As the Mongols go, they destroy kind of the original salt mines and kill a bunch of people in the Crimean Peninsula and southern Ukraine. It's currently ruled by Russia right now. So kind of the breakdown of access to those salt mines gives this new impetus to the salt industry of Galicia-Volhynia. So all of a sudden, rather than being kind of like a secondary source of salt, they become the main source of salt for a lot of these Eastern European states and become very, very wealthy, and they attract the enmity of all of their neighbors. You have the Mongols, who are eager for tribute. They kill a couple of the princes of Galicia-Volhynia in the 14th century, since, of course, the princes of Galicia-Volhynia don't want to be tributaries to the Mongols. It's very expensive to pay off these, very, very ferocious nomads who, even 100 years after Genghis Khan, are very, very capable under the Golden Horde, which was kind of the Mongol successor state in the steppe and in the Volga region in Eastern Europe. You have the Hungarians, who are also eager to extend their power across the Carpathian Mountains and, again, control those trade routes, the supply of salt. And then you have the Poles and the Lithuanians, so, who have their own interests. So the Lithuanians, they start off, they're scattered into all of these different kind of Baltic tribes. They're distinctive from the Slavs, and they're still pagan deep into the 14th century. And what had happened was, under the pressure of the Russians from the east, as well as the kind of German Teutonic Knights from the west, these kind of primitive Balt peoples start to unify and consolidate their authority more and more. And of course, where do they go when they expand it? It's not the ferocious Germans to the west or the Russians to the east that they can, like the great power of Novgorod, that they go and they rival. They instead expand to where power is weakest and where they can establish their authority the easiest, which is to the south. So there's all these Rus princes who, now there's no block of Rus princes to stand against Balt or Mongol or whoever. So it's these Lithuanians who kind of step in and they take over a lot of Belarus and Ukraine as well during the 14th century. And at the same time, you have Vladimir Suzdal, which is the strongest principality of the Rus states in that kind of Golden Ring territory, and they're involved in all sorts of factional struggles. Vladimir Suzdal ends up disintegrating over the course of the 13th and 14th centuries, despite some victories, like the famous victories by Alexander Nevsky over the Teutonic Order at the Battle of Lake Peipus. Their kind of authority gradually disintegrates. So those are the kind of five main powers. We have the Mongol Golden Horde, we have Catholic Poland, pagan Lithuania, Orthodox Muscovy, and Orthodox Galicia-Volhynia. So out of those, several of them will collapse in the next 200 years, and some of the other ones will be absorbed to various degrees. Galicia-Volhynia, one of their rulers dies while not having any adult heirs, so it ends up being feuded over for like a 40 or 50 year period in the second half of the 14th century, so in the late 1300s. You have, these Hungarians go and they claim that Galicia-Volhynia is theirs for some dynastic reason. I think one of them was the nephew by the guy's sister or something. Don't quote me on that. So they go and they end up claiming control of Galicia-Volhynia. And that claim in the late 1300s actually ends up being very important because it's the same claim that Maria Theresa uses, the Archduchess of Austria, in the 18th century to legitimize her rule of Galicia and Volhynia, which we'll go over in part 3 next week. In the end, though, the Poles and Lithuanians end up dividing it in two. The Poles get one part, and the Lithuanians get the other part. So the Lithuanians, they're under all this pressure, and they have this great mass of these kind of Slavic-speaking subjects. The Lithuanians are only something like 20% of the population of their Grand Duchy, since they rule so much of Belarus and Ukraine. So what ends up happening, they're intermarrying with these different, kind of Rus or Ruthenian, as, they're called the, I think it was the Rex Rutheniae or something in Latin, the King of Ruthenia, was a title that some of them aspired to. So they, they have all these wives who are Slavic rather than Lithuanian. They have people in their courts who are Orthodox. Later in the 1400s, even one of them, Casimir IV, he goes and he's actually a native Slavic speaker, not a, Slavic is an East Slavic and Ruthenian. Ruthenian kind of being like pre-Ukrainian, whereas Russian was spoken further to the east in Muscovy. So again, this is kind of where, there had already been pre-existing dialectical differences. There still were there, even as early as the 14th century. So you have kind of this rising Ruthenian Slavic Orthodox element within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania within the 14th century. Now further to the east, you have Moscow. So after the Mongols come in, they kill tons of people. There's huge die-offs, anarchy, all of that. Political authority collapses. There's famines. Lands that were once agricultural are reverted to pasture land. The Orthodox Church, of course, suffers as well. So the Orthodox Church ends up relocating. One branch of them, they have a metropolitan in the city of Halich, which is in that kind of wealthy Western Ukrainian area of Galicia-Volhynia that we were talking about earlier. And the other one ends up in Moscow, which ends up being hugely important. So Moscow now has this center of church authority within it. And, the church benefits them immensely. They have, kind of the taxes coming in. They have people coming to see the metropolitan, who's their religious figure. It combined, the effect is to raise the prestige of Moscow and raise its wealth, raise its kind of cultural appeal, even independent of what the local ruler of Moscow does. So that's kind of a big advantage that the Muscovites have going forth in the 14th century. So the Lithuanians at the same time, they're kind of expanding, and they run into the Tatars, the Golden Horde. And the Lithuanians, they're intensely militarized. Some of these tribal societies, even though they dwelled in swamps, could mobilize a huge fraction of their men. If they were based out of something like the Lithuanians were, out of kind of like exploitation of coastal resources, such as fishing, rather than agriculture. So in the late 1300s, Lithuanians actually have a giant battle against the Mongols and Tatars and ends up losing. And that's kind of the thing that blocks the expansion of the Lithuanians further and further into the eastern steppes. The Mongols end up holding on to that region of the steppe for another 100 years. So that's kind of the end of the 14th century. And one of the most important events, both of this time as well as possibly all of Eastern European history, is the marriage of Queen Jadwiga of Poland to the Grand Duke of Lithuania. So the Lithuanians, even though they had been becoming more and more powerful, dominating this power vacuum of Belarus and Ukraine, fighting with the various steppe tribes, they go and they're still having all these issues from the Teutonic Order. The Teutonic Order was, a very unique group, I guess. I mean, you have a lot of different holy orders, but the Teutonic Knights were extremely ruthless and extremely skilled in war. There were only something like 800 knights out of a population of 400,000, like we were discussing earlier. They would campaign quite literally every single year. They would come up with their supplies, they would put together their ships, and then they would sail around the Baltic and, end up sailing down the rivers. They would go and they'd raid the Lithuanians. And the whole goal was to force the Lithuanians to convert to Christianity. And Lithuanians were very stubborn. Some of them did convert and then immediately changed their minds and reverted to their kind of original polytheistic religion. There's tales of like knights being sacrificed to whatever gods the Lithuanians worshipped. Sometimes Lithuanians would pretend that they'd converted to Christianity and then, invite the Teutonic Knights and celebrate Mass with them, and then they just murder them or try to murder them. And the Knights weren't saints either. They would go, just like massacre villages, all sorts of terrible, terrible stuff. Their view of the Baltic peoples hardened as time went on. The earliest, there's kind of two main cultural records of the Teutonic Knights. The first one is this, I believe he's a Franciscan friar with the Knights who's going in, and they're just kind of converting the Baltic peoples, talking about love and friendship and whatnot. And then a couple decades later, there's the Livonian Rhymed Chronicle, where there's this German knight who's going and talking about how much he loves fighting, and he loves Virgin Mary, the Mother of Jesus Christ, and how the Lithuanians, they're every bit as brave and honorable as him, but at the same time, they're inspired by Satan and therefore should be destroyed. And he goes and ends up like praising God, that God has granted him enemies which he can fight and seek martyrdom. So the Teutonic Knights, definitely very, very scary, brave, courageous, skillful people. Many of them were very literate as well, so they could, that gave them an advantage with development of artillery, kind of organizing their expeditions, making sure they were well supplied. Education then, just as now, does give people advantages. So the Lithuanians, they're under the pressure of the Teutonic Knights. They're pushing deeper and deeper into the core of Lithuania. And a lot of this was due to their advantages in technology, like artillery, naval power, that kind of thing. So the Lithuanians, they, of course, don't want to lose control of their homeland, and they look at the situation. They see there's this Queen of Poland who's very young. She's not married, and they can go and win an alliance with the Poles, who are, very, very annoyed with the Teutonic Knights for choking off their trade. And at the same time, there's a lot of Germans, too, who are in contact with the Poles. They also don't like the Teutonic Knights. They just settled there to get rich off the bounties of the Vistula River trade. They're not really interested in converting people. They just want to get rich, which makes sense. A lot of them were, unsurprisingly, from the Netherlands, which has a stereotype for being just like that even today. So the Queen of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania, they marry, and they have all sorts of internal struggles. You still have, the Lithuanians agree to adopt Catholicism rather than Orthodoxy, and they end up being in a personal union. So the Lithuanians are still separate from the Poles, but they, kind of agree to act together. So there's people that aren't happy with this, for hundreds and hundreds of years. That causes all sorts of internal struggles, and we'll go over some of them. So the Teutonic Knights, they're of course understandably fearful of this. They go and they help out some of the Lithuanian separatists that don't want Lithuania to be part of Poland, and they're actually quite successful initially in the 1390s and the first decade of the 1400s. So, eventually, though, the Poles and Lithuanians, they put together this huge force. The Teutonic Knights put together this huge force, and they meet each other at a place called Tannenberg. And the Teutonic Knights and their, various German and whatnot allies are defeated by this great alliance of Slavs and Balts. You've got like Poles, Ruthenians. I think there were even some Russians there, Tatars, Lithuanians. Basically, everyone came together in that part of Europe. They fought this terrible battle. The Poles won. And, Lithuania's independence, or I guess independence from the Germans, I should say, not the Poles, was temporarily saved. So you have this marriage alliance between the Poles and Lithuanians that just continually gets stronger for several hundred years, from, the late 1300s all the way until the mid to late 1500s. You have this series of unions. So the Lithuanians, again, are kind of like this poorer people. You have, they're separated by, various, they're in different river basins from their Slavic and Orthodox subjects, heavily intermarrying with these subjects. But even then, the kind of Ruthenians they rule over, those Eastern Slavic Orthodox people, aren't as culturally as advanced as the Poles. The Poles they set up colleges to educate the Lithuanian nobility. So a lot of these Lithuanians end up speaking Polish rather than Lithuanian. They end up intermarrying with Poles more and more often, and a lot of them end up Catholic rather than Orthodox. So that ends up kind of so Lithuania, well into the 1400s, the 15th century, had a chance to be absorbed into that kind of broader Eastern Slavic world. And we could have had, kind of a parallel of what's nowadays Ukraine, or the western part of Ukraine, kind of like a Catholic Eastern Slavic state that would have been, defined in opposition both to the Catholic Western Slavic Poles to the west, as well as the Orthodox Eastern Slavic Russians to the east. So that's kind of one alternative history that could have been, that was ended by this marriage between the Lithuanians and the Poles. So basically the Grand Duchy of Lithuania ends up Polonized rather than the Grand Duchy of Lithuania ending up Ruthenianized. So as time goes on, further to the east, you have the Muscovites. They're aggressively going. Moscow was kind of shielded from the various Mongol and Tatar raids. They're in what's kind of like a forested region. They're off the Oka River, so not even the main river. I guess they're off the Moskva River, which the Moskva River, Moscow River, feeds into the Oka, and then the Oka eventually goes into the Volga, what's nowadays, was then too, Nizhny Novgorod. So the Muscovites, they're not really the center of anything other than religion, and they're obscure enough that the Mongols like them to be the tax collector. One of the Mongol rulers in the 1300s, his name was literally Ivan Moneybags, Ivan Kalita, just because he was so rich collecting the tax for the Mongols from all the other different Rus states. So over the 1300s, Moscow just gets stronger and stronger, and they have kind of a succession of these long-lived rulers. They don't have as much internal chaos. And that was one of the nice things that the Black Plague did. So normally a sovereign, he'd be very healthy. He could have, if one wife dies in childbirth, he could find another one that he could marry, to give him more children. So there were, always an excess of sons. And the sons would either tend to fragment the realm, as had happened in the Rus many times before. So it'd just be a ton of like little tiny principalities and statelets. They wouldn't have much wealth or strength on their own. Or you could go and you would just have these brutal civil wars if the state was more centralized and different sons were worried about, getting cut out of the inheritance, being poor, or just being murdered by their other brothers who were jealous for their power. So the Muscovites were actually blessed by the Great Plague, or Black Plague, which came in the middle of the 14th century, killed tons and tons of people, including most of the Muscovite ruling family. So as a result, they wouldn't have a civil war until the 1420s or 1430s, I believe. So they just had this very, very long stretch of internal peace. They had this very close relationship with the Orthodox Church. So they end up in a much, and they're nice to the Mongols as well, who choose them to be their chosen tax collectors. So Moscow has all this stuff going for it, and they're gradually consolidating these very poor lands, off the Moskva, the Oka, and eventually the Volga rivers. Meanwhile, to the north, Novgorod, which is this big trading center, is descending into an oligarchy. You have kind of like the ordinary people getting squeezed out of the elective government, and you have this smaller and smaller cabals of oligarchs who are taking control. They're launching these raids into the Finno-Ugrian lands, the far north, in this great race for furs. The Mongols are doing it too, but the Novgorodians, I guess, were just better at it. Of course, the Finno-Ugrian peoples, they're launching their own counter raids across into the Rus lands as well. But, their lands are just so cold and frozen and barren that they can't support the kind of same populations that the various Rus and increasingly Russian peoples were. Some of those northern regions actually do have a population boom. What's nowadays Kirov Oblast, in particular, their population explodes over the course of the 1300s. You have what used to be a largely Udmurt, which is Udmurts are a Finno-Ugrian people. They have all of these people who go and they migrate from the kind of Rus states into the region, and it becomes Slavic dominated, even though there was a strong Tatar influence as well. The Tatars, they were a Turkic people. Some of them had been in kind of Eastern Europe and the Volga Basin before. Others came with the Mongols, which we can see in DNA too. There is kind of a small amount of East Asiatic ancestry that kind of flows into the region right around the end of the Middle Ages. So the average Tatar today is maybe like 5 to 10%, East Asian, loosely defined in ancestry from, specifically the East Asians that migrated with Genghis Khan and the Mongols, rather than, the more Siberian Asiatic groups that had been there for thousands of years during the Great Uralic migrations at the end of the Bronze Age and beginning of the Iron Age. So anyhow, Moscow's expanding into that region, Novgorod's declining. So that is the situation in the kind of early to mid 1400s. So when of course, we're focused on Ukraine. So the ancestors of the Ukrainians, the Ruthenians, who were divided at that point between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland, were actually very supportive of the Lithuanian separatist efforts against the kind of guys who are running the Union of Poland and Lithuania. They very much liked their influence with the Lithuanian court. They did not like how there were these arrogant Polish landlords that just showed up and taxed them. They didn't like that these Polish settlers were moving into their areas. And they thought they were being neglected too in kind of the defense of their realm. And that was a perpetual issue that would just drag on for hundreds of years. You still had these Turkic-speaking steppe nomads that were raiding the settled Ruthenian agricultural peoples. and the faraway Poles just didn't care as much. The Poles at the same time, they had these powerful landholding families that had, they were just so far away from Warsaw that the central government couldn't really do anything about them. So they're going and doing all sorts of abuses on the Ukrainians in Galicia and Volhynia in the west. So Lithuanians are definitely very, very much preferred. More distant, nicer rulers is kind of the general take I've gotten from my reading. And of course, the Poles are much, much more religious than Lithuanians are and trying to force everyone to be Catholic. Some of them actually do end up being Catholic, although that's later in the 16th century. So in the 1400s, you go and you see, you have Timur the Lame. He's this warlord from Central Asia, what's nowadays Uzbekistan. He launches all sorts of conquests all over the world. And he goes and he devastates the kind of steppe Turkic tribes a lot, so they're very weak. And the Russians really, they have their own fights against the steppe Turkic tribes as well, and are actually quite successful. There was some giant battle, and I think it was 1380, or maybe it was a stand. But the Muscovites, the Russians in Moscow, they'd gotten strong enough to that point where they can agree to not pay the steppe tribes tribute after that. The Russians at the same time, they also, going back hundreds of years, they'd had problems with these steppe tribes, so they go and they built this massive wooden wall kind of on their border with this steppe. And they expand it, over the hundreds of years. And they also seek out allies from other peoples who will be enemies of the steppe peoples as well. So at the end of the 15th century, kind of the late 1400s, the Muscovites are reaching out to some of the Caucasian peoples from the North Caucasus, who would be related to the, I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce this, the Adyghe people of, the Circassians of kind of the northwestern Caucasus. About 100 years later, the Grand Duke of Moscow, Ivan the Terrible, he would, first Tsar of Russia, actually, he would go and, marry a Circassian woman as one of his, I think it was 6 wives. Don't quote me on that, though. They also reach out to the Crimean Tatars, who are a Turkic people who are living in the peninsula of Crimea, and they form this kind of alliance against the Poles and Lithuanians at the end of the 15th century. So by then, the Muscovites, they had actually been banned from importing artillery by the Swedes, who, the Swedes and the Danes were unified back then, and they kind of blocked access to the Baltic Sea to the Muscovites. So the people of Moscow actually went and they hired these Italians to teach them how to make artillery. So they started making artillery, and the artillery was just, unbelievably powerful. They were able to take these old medieval fortresses very, very easily, overran Novgorod, subjugated all these other states. So just, a lot of conquests in a very short period as a result of having the big guns. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, they were subject people and didn't have any independence at that point. So you have these wars. The Lithuanians had taken over the city of Smolensk, which is strategic due to its location on a river. So a very important point if you want to offload all your goods into the Dnieper River, eventually sell it down to the Black Sea, you've got to have Smolensk. So the Russians, they aim at taking Smolensk, since that's kind of their nearest, the city that's nearest to them, had been part of Rus, and they fight all of these wars for hundreds of years over Smolensk, as well as the other cities and regions that had been owned by the Eastern Slavic peoples during the period of Kiev and Rus. Now, at the same time, when we talk about Lithuania versus Russia or Ukraine versus Poland, we have to remember too that these were not unified nation states. They were very particularistic states. Like for Moscow, for instance, you would have a nobleman could rule a certain area. He might have an obligation to provide certain numbers of troops or taxes. Lithuania, same thing, except since they were even less literate people than the Russians in some ways, a lot of this stuff would be more personalized rather than formalized. And there were attempts by all the various states, which to kind of rationalize these systems of taxation, regularize tribute into taxation, to regularize troop recruitment, regularize internal tolls, tariffs, taxes, promotions into the nobility, military commissions. But it was a very slow process, and for the period we're talking about, it was very much highly particularistic, and a lot of personal relationships. So a lot of these, kind of East Slavic speaking, Ruthenian or Russian, whatever you want to call them, noblemen who are kind of on the border of Russia and Lithuania could be kind of mercenary at different times. Some of them were willing to switch their allegiance from the Lithuanians over to the Grand Duchy of Moscow and the Russians out of reasons for religious solidarity. They wanted to be ruled by an Orthodox Grand Duke rather than a Catholic Grand Duke. Some of them just wanted access to the Volga River trade, which the Muscovites had more power over than the Lithuanians did. And, conversely, there were other people on the, ruled by Muscovy and the Russians at that point who, wanted access to the Baltic trade, and were willing to sell out the Muscovites to the Lithuanians in order to win those benefits. That was particularly an issue in the city of Novgorod, kind of in northern Russia, which was very, very big into the Baltic trade and very, very much needed at least some friendship with the Lithuanians and the Baltic powers so they could reach it. So you have all these wars that go on. You keep on having the steppe that's devastated by these Turkic tribes. And you have, like we were talking about earlier, you originally have this marriage between the, Queen of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania back at the end of the 1300s. So over the 1400s, the Catholic Church makes efforts to convert the Orthodox peoples under, kind of Polish-Lithuanian rule into, Catholicism. Now, that's not actually, they're kind of like a back and forth, but the main effort to it was following what's called the Union of Brest. So, and this is all the way in the kind of late 1500s. The Poles go to the city of Brest, which is in nowadays southwestern Belarus, like just across the Polish border. And they go and they get a bunch of kind of Orthodox bishops to sign an agreement that they will now listen to the Catholic Church rather than the Orthodox Church, even though they keep their rights and all sorts of stuff. So as a result, kind of that, like a lot of Western Ukraine ends up being Catholic rather than Orthodox, even if they kept their own rights. And that was kind of a culmination of a lot of consolidation within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and its integration with Poland. Even back after that giant Battle of Tannenberg that we talked about in 1410, you had this Treaty of Horodlo, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. I cannot speak Polish, which kind of, again, brings the Lithuanians, you have all these Lithuanian nobles that are adopted into these Polish families. You have, a lot more of them have their, like, legality, I guess, understood in the concept of Poles rather than, kind of the traditions of Lithuania. And there's a bunch of families. You can read them all on Wikipedia. I don't recognize really any of their names other than the Grief family, Gryf, which I think ended up becoming a German family, at some point in the future. So anyhow, there's a couple more unions. The treaties bring the Lithuanians closer and closer. And finally, by the mid 16th century, you have like a formal union where rather than just being, you're the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania at the same time, but they have their separate laws. No, you're the kind of sovereign ruler of this one unified polity that cannot be divided anymore. Even though, of course, there still remained different particularities and whatnot between the two different states, which would continue to cause issues all the way until the very end of Poland-Lithuania. So in the 1500s, Russia just gets stronger and stronger. You have the Tatars who just cannot stand up to the artillery that the Russians are making. The Russians have access to these iron mines now, and they're, sending it down the Volga River, building this stuff in Moscow. Orthodox Church is helping out. And they have this series of cataclysmic wars with another group of Turkic-speaking peoples, the Volga Tatars, who are based out of the city of Kazan. So, periodically for hundreds of years, the, Volga River had been, sometimes it was open when the kind of Turkic peoples were friendly with the Slavic peoples, and other times the Volga River would be closed to the Eastern Slavic peoples when the Turkic peoples were unhappy with them or fighting them. So Ivan the Fourth Grozny, the Terrible, could also be translated as the awesome, the imposing. The Terrible was translated by 16th century, era English people. Think like Shakespeare. A lot of that stuff. The words have changed in their meaning since that time. Of course, he was a pretty terrible guy too. Definitely terrorized a lot of his subjects. He, 150 years before Peter the Great, he very much wanted Russia to have access to the Baltic Sea. Again, that's how you made all your money. You had to be able to sail it on the open sea and go to any port you wanted to. It was a lot more complicated than that, because at the time Denmark actually would make you pay a sound toll when you sailed past them. And they used their navy to force everyone to, pay them for quite some time. And I think the Swedes eventually stopped them in the 17th century. But we'll go over that part later. So the Russians get stronger and stronger. They sack Kazan. They take over all of these Tatar areas. They push their great wooden wall further and further into the steppe. Their population's growing. And then, kind of like Ivan the Fourth, he's a crazy guy. There's some people that chalk it up to, I think, mercury poisoning. Might have been lead poisoning. I can't remember. But he goes and he kills one of his sons, who's supposed to be his heir. So as a result, it only leaves another one of his sons who's not really that capable. That son goes and dies. Let me look up his name. It was, let's see. Yeah, Fyodor Ivanovich. He goes, not really a capable guy, and eventually dies, possibly murdered by a guy called Boris Godunov. At the very end of the 16th century. So after he dies, that's the extinction of that kind of old dynasty that traces its origins back to the Finns and the Vikings. And Russia enters in this time of troubles, which lasts for like 15 or 16 years. The population falls by half. People are dying. There's anarchy. The Jesuits sponsor. By that time, the Jesuit order had appeared. And actually, let's take a couple minutes to go over them. We talk about conspiracy theories, and a lot of them are crazy, but at the same time, historically, there actually were world-spanning conspiracies. The Jesuit order, in a 30-year period, they, administered the city of Nagasaki in Japan as a port city. They administered what's nowadays Paraguay on behalf of the Spanish and organized the population there. They had an audience with the Mughal Emperor Akbar in India. So they were just hugely, hugely influential, and it was no exception in Eastern Europe. The Jesuits picked the absolute best of the best people to represent them. Just even one or two Jesuits was, in my opinion, enough to change the course of history at that point. So the Jesuits, they were very much in league with the kings of Poland. And the Poles at that time, as to a lesser extent the Lithuanians as well, they had conquered those Germans who were living in Prussia, although they were kind of autonomous. and not really subject to the same rule as the other Poles. And through them, you have the spread of this anti-Catholic movement, Protestantism, and actually a majority of the Polish nobility at one point in the late 1500s was Protestant rather than Catholic. Now, the nobles in Poland by that point, they had been able to negotiate with their king a pretty good deal. That they'd have all sorts of privileges. They couldn't be forced to convert religions or anything like that. So they had a lot of freedoms, some of which I think actually inspired our own, revolution and Bill of Rights and stuff. So the Jesuits, they weren't able to forcibly convert anyone. They had to focus on converting people by convincing them to be Catholic rather than just saying, hey, you've got to be Catholic or we'll burn you at the stake. So the Poles, the Jesuits were very involved in that. They set up all these schools in Lithuania and Poland. They tried to get as many of the Polish and Lithuanian nobility to go to school under them as possible. And at the same time, they were, hugely ambitious. They believed it was their duty and openly conspired to bring the whole world under the Catholic Church. So one of the things they did was they went and they said that Ivan, the terrible son, Dmitri, was not actually dead, and that he was alive, and conveniently enough, married to the daughter of this very, very powerful Polish man who controlled a lot of territories in, I think, Western Ukraine. So a guy who had extensive involvement with the Eastern Slavic peoples, but was nonetheless a militant Catholic, and of course, who wouldn't want their grandson to be ruler of a powerful country? So he's called the False Dmitri, or the first False Dmitri, I should say, by historians. He's backed by the Jesuits, the Poles. They send this army, they take Moscow. It's just a very, very bad time for Russia. Everything's collapsing. And the Russians have this kind of uprising. The Orthodox Church, a lot of the nobility, they do not want to be ruled by this guy who's Catholic and, probably Polish and backed by all these super shady Jesuits. Religious hatred was very, very extreme back then. Kind of the Catholic Orthodox conflict had been going on since, probably before even the Teutonic Knights. There had been all sorts of massacres and counter-massacres, and, the giant, you had the Livonian War, where tons of people were killed. Most of the Estonian population died during that conflict. You had, the wars at the very end of the 15th century in like the 1490s and 1500s. Tons of people died in those as well. So just tons of hatred. These wars, they kind of like, in the movies, they portray them as soldiers just kind of like marching in lines and slaughtering each other. But a lot of it was just roving bands of, soldiers raping, murdering, burning, tons of people starving to death. So it was, just tons of religious hatred. So, you have these two guys, they go and they raise this Russian army, they expel False Dmitri. I think they end up like loading him into a cannon and then blowing his corpse out in the direction of Poland. They didn't like him at all. So, that was kind of the end of the Jesuit plot against Russia. I think the same woman who had married that False Dmitri ends up marrying another guy, and they're like, oh yeah, you didn't kill the real Dmitri. This is actually the real Dmitri, and he's called False Dmitri too. And he doesn't get as far as the first False Dmitri. But it just kind of goes on, and finally the Poles are defeated. The Russians, peace returns, and the Russian state is unified under a new dynasty, the Romanov dynasty. The Romanovs were not descended from the Rurikovichi. It's believed they descended from a stable boy, actually, who I think lived in 12th century Novgorod, became a nobleman. I can't remember his exact story. Don't quote me on that. Anyhow, like by the time of I think it was 1612, might have been 1614, his uncle, the guy who they end up picking to be the new Tsar, is the like metropolitan or some sort of powerful religious figure. So he's like, hey, let's just pick my nephew. He agrees to rule in concert with a lot of the nobility and the church, and he has a lot of popular support. One nice thing about mass die-offs in pre-modern societies is that it leaves a lot of farmland open. So normally, you have, people have like 6 kids. They keep on having kids as long as they can because it's more, labor they can use to get their farm richer, to, make secondary products, hides, whatever. Um, so people very quickly reach that kind of Malthusian limit to what a land can support. So, once you hit that limit, people start becoming miserable. They're poor, they're starving, their kids start dying. Everyone hates each other, and that causes all sorts of issues. So the nice thing is Russia has this kind of buffer for a couple decades that helps them, at least relative to the other countries, survive the cataclysms of the mid 17th century, which we'll go over in probably like 10 minutes. Um, just want to kind of rewind, go back to the 1490s and 1500s. So we're going back 100 years before Ivan the Terrible and all them, before Poland and Lithuania are fully consolidated. You have, one of the Grand Dukes of Moscow. His name is Ivan III. He has a wife. He has several children by her, and then his wife dies, and he marries another woman who is the niece of the last emperor of the Byzantine Empire or Eastern Roman Empire. And he has children by her too, or at least one child. So they're his kind of two. So his daughter-in-law for the son by the first wife is a rival of his, much younger second wife. And they have this kind of competition. And, the daughter-in-law is linked to this group called the Judaizers. And I'm not sure. There's a lot of like different disputes about them. The term Judaizer was not meant to be complimentary. They were, of course, intensely anti-Jewish, as well as being anti-Catholic and anti-Muslim. They were very strong Orthodox Christians at that time. And there were, from what we have records of them, it looks like they were almost a proto-Protestant sect. They wanted, kind of the monasteries to be, dissolved, turned over to the private sector. At least that was what the nobility who wanted them to be supported, believed. They, weren't that fond of, they did support kind of asceticism, but not like in a monastic setting necessarily. And then conversely, had the second wife, who was more of a traditional Orthodox Christian, as we would recognize them today, very heavily influenced by the Greeks. So anyhow, she wins out, as well as this guy called Yosef. Yosef, he goes a major religious figure in the Orthodox Church, and another figure who kind of aligns the Orthodox Church, in parallel and in cooperation with the Grand Dukes of Moscow, rather than in opposition. So he's another very important figure. So kind of flash forwarding. So we're in the 1600s. You have these terrible wars, the time of troubles, and you also have a new power, the Swedes, who are rising up. The Swedes got independence from Denmark, I believe, it was 1527, might have been 1529. Don't quote me on that. And there's only about 1 million people in Sweden, so it's a very small, unpopulated area. Except they're extremely militarized. Over the course of the 16th century, the Swedish nobility, which traditionally had been like very tribal, very independent, which makes sense given the geography of Sweden. It's a very fragmented area, not so much as Norway, but certainly more so than a lot of the other states of Europe. So they go and they're fighting these wars abroad, and during these wars abroad, they just keep on getting richer and richer. By the point they get into the 17th century, the 1600s, wars actually make Sweden money. Rather than being an expense, they're just getting rich from all this plunder. Almost in a repeat actually, I should say, of the Viking era. So war becomes the reason of state for the Swedes. Whereas you see in Poland and Russia, whereas they want peace, they can focus on internal development, develop their trade routes. Sweden very much needs war. It's a very poor, barren country, and they have to go forth to conquer. So, in the second half of the 16th century, the Swedes just become more and more militaristic. They set up registers to draft soldiers, and it starts off just being as a draft for the national defense. But as time goes on, it quickly becomes a draft for, the regular military as well. This gives the Swedes a tremendous advantage since they have those kind of institutions that they could scale up for major wars on the continent. They didn't have to worry about hiring expensive mercenaries from abroad. They could count on their reliability, and at the same time, they had the rise of Protestantism, which enabled them to seize the lands of the Catholic Church and use those lands as the financial basis for a new state. So that's kind of an interesting contrast you see between the Poles on one hand, who still have the Catholic Church, which exists in parallel and separate from the kind of Polish-Lithuanian government. You have the Russian government, based out of Moscow, which has the Orthodox Church in parallel to it, but with which it's very closely entwined with. At various points, the Orthodox Church was collecting taxes on behalf of the Russian government, for instance. And then you have the Swedish government, which is very much a modern, almost, I don't want to say secular state, but, they very much run the church rather than the church having a parallel authority. That's one of the reasons that's given for kind of the fanaticism of Swedish soldiers shown in certain campaigns. They were convinced that the Protestant God, for lack of a better description, was on their side. And, if they died fighting, they went to heaven. That was certainly true for other states as well, but the Swedes, were very effective at kind of indoctrinating their soldiers within that. So the Swedes rapidly emerge as a power in the Baltic. You have Denmark is kind of declining in that period. They are collecting, anyone who sails past Denmark to go from the Baltic Sea to go into the North Sea actually has to pay a sound toll. And that was a good chunk of Danish state revenue, actually. So the Danes, that's one reason the Swedes actually end up becoming more powerful than the Danes. The Swedes focus on military development. They focus on building up draft registrars, improving their state capacity, whereas the Danes remain more of like a naval toll power and never kind of build up their power over the nobility that the Swedes end up doing. So, that's why the Swedes end up being the great northern power for a while rather than the, Danes. So going forward, you have, there's leagues in Germany. Germany was, very populous, very wealthy, not raided by Turkic nomads. The population was quite substantial. And you have these leagues within the Holy Roman Empire. Just like the other states of the time, the Holy Roman Empire, it, did consider itself the emperor considered himself the lord of everything. But at the same time, it wasn't as tightly knit as the other states of Europe necessarily were. You had princes forming together in leagues, some of them backing Protestantism, some of them backing Catholicism. They fought all sorts of wars, and it eventually culminated in the 30 Years' War, which lasted from 1618 all the way until 1648. Just an absolutely apocalyptic struggle. Something like a third of the population of Germany died. There's some parts of northeastern Germany where the Swedes spent a lot of time, where an outright majority of the population was killed. There's some towns in, near what's nowadays Berlin, where just most of the population died. So it very, very much sucked to live there. But that's kind of a topic for another time. The Swedes were very, very heavily involved in that war, though, and one of the things the Swedes did was they wanted to seize these strategic outposts all over the Baltic Sea so they could control the outlets of all the rivers into the Baltic. So they go, and they're actually very successful in that. They take over all sorts of, river outlets and become intensely involved in the politics of Russia and Poland, as well as Germany. So the Russians, of course, they're very, very jealous of that. They very, very much want their outlet to the Baltic Sea. They don't like being stuck worrying about the salt tax, which was one of the ways their state gained revenue, and it was hugely unpopular. I believe 1645, I want to say. Again, don't quote me on that. There was actually this huge riot in Moscow. Tons of people got killed. There's all this chaos over the salt tax. So they very, very much wanted to find other sources of revenue that weren't so unpopular, that wouldn't cause a revolution, and they could build up their state capacity without being hated by their people. The Russians also focused. They had a northern trade route based out of. You had this Eastern Slavic group called the Pomors, which literally means like the people by the sea, Pomoria. Pause by, more, more, is sea. So you have those guys, but it's still kind of like just a very, very, they're almost in the, I think that might be in the Arctic Circle. If not, it's very, very close by. Just a very, very cold, harsh climate. The Russians were breeding a special type of cattle that could survive the cold. The Holmogary cattle, they're still alive today. You can see them. They're very cool. There's a DNA study on them that came out about a year ago, which is very neat. That kind of showed their evolution from kind of normal Eastern European cows into being bred for cold resistance. And the Yakuts actually, all the way over in central eastern Siberia, developed their own kind of strain of cold resistant cattle. Anyhow, that's kind of like getting off topic here. So you have the other kind of like, Eastern Slavic group that's up there that's ruled by the Russians, and that's how the Russians are doing a lot of their trade. They have this northern trade route that goes through the Arctic, and a lot of it's based out of England, actually. They're directly trading with England for quite some time. There were like ambassadors from Queen Elizabeth that, they still have like letters from. And some of those English people are the, sources for Russian history for that era. Other than that, a lot of the, we talked earlier, you have all of those different Rus states. And, of course, they all had their own dialects. They all had their own identities, their noble families. A lot of those kind of languages and identities died off in the 16th and 17th century. Russian, is a very kind of like leveled language, I guess I should say, at least compared to English. Like even in American English, you have African American vernacular, you have like kind of Southern drawls, you have the New Orleans accent, you have even my hometown of Pittsburgh has kind of its own unique accent. There was a kind of a weird mix of like Slavic and like Northern Irish, I guess, is what I've heard. I'm not a linguist though, so don't quote me on that. But anyhow, it had to do with because England hasn't had mass die-offs and expansions from these kind of smaller, more linguistically homogenous groups in a very, very long time. I mean, I think the worst catastrophe in English history was kind of that middle 17th century crisis with the, which happened all over the world, but hit England too. But even then, England was kind of lucky, and I think only something like a 20th or a 15th of the population ended up dying, which of course is horrible, but it was, much better than what happened with Poland and Ukraine, which we'll soon discuss. So anyhow, like Ivan the Terrible, his massacres of Novgorod, his like state terror, broke up a lot of these urban populations, as well as the mass die-offs, which killed most of the population in the time of troubles from 1598 to 1612. Kind of homogenized Russia in a lot of ways. The structure of Russia, too, did play a role. So much of the state was based around fending off these, kind of Turkic-speaking steppe nomads that, like, people were forcibly stationed in these garrisons. They were bound to the land. You couldn't move. The government wouldn't let you, and it wasn't just because the government was evil. The government needed farmers there to feed the garrisons. They needed people to be ready to bear arms to, garrison the walls and form ranks against the, these steppe nomads if, the steppe nomads came. Because the steppe nomads were still very, very much a threat, like well into the 1600s. They sacked Moscow a couple times. The number of people they enslaved was just enormous. And, they could look to their kind of Eastern Slavic brothers in the Ukraine and, just kind of see what misery awaited them if they didn't have this kind of very authoritarian, very regimented social structure. Between, I believe, 1500 and 1700, something like 1.5 million Slavic people, predominantly from Ukraine, but also from Poland, Belarus, and Russia, were enslaved by these, Turkic-speaking Crimean Tatar raiders and sold, most of them, to the Ottoman Empire. Genetic impact, difficult to say. Hopefully we'll get some early modern Turkish DNA and get a better idea. Very, very possible that, as much as maybe a tenth of the ancestry of modern-day Turkish people comes from all of these Slavic slaves that they went and picked up during these, or purchased, I should say, during these endless raids. And it wasn't just the Slavs being enslaved, of course, too. Italians were enslaved, the Armenians, Circassians, Georgians, all sorts. So going back, you have the development also in kind of the 15 and 1600s of a new group of people called the Cossacks. There were some Slavs that they ran away, whether it was just from, they didn't like the agricultural life, or, they were escaping the increasing authority of the Tsar of the Tsar of Russia. And they kind of adopted the kind of mixed nomadic and agricultural and pastoral lifestyle of these Turkic nomads. It possibly went back a lot further. There's some evidence from, what's nowadays the Kuban region of Russia that, there were other Slavs that did this even 1,000 years ago. But a lot of this stuff comes from kind of the 15 and 1600s. You have all these people, and a lot of them end up living in the Dnieper Rapids area. So that kind of region in the Dnieper River, the south of Kiev and the north of modern-day Dnipro, or Dnipropetrovsk in Russian. You can't really sail a boat down it. You would either have to get all your people out of the boat and gradually get guys with ropes who are kind of towing it very, very slowly to make sure it doesn't break up on rocks, or just pick up your boat altogether and transport it by land right next to the river before you can set it down on another part of the river, where you can actually sail it without hitting a rock and sinking. So a lot of those guys, they kind of consolidated, or not consolidated, but lived around that area. They formed bands, and that's another kind of source of kind of the modern Ukrainian identity, modern Ukrainian linguistics. These guys, very fierce warriors, they're very much desired by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as mercenaries. They set up a Cossack register, which would become very, very important in the 17th century, since they would go and they'd kind of have these guys on a salary. And since they were so valued as soldiers and kind of frontier guards against the Turkic nomads. So this Cossack register, they'd give a certain number of these kind of Ukrainian or Cossack people a regular salary, and in return they'd be provided to, or be required to, show up and fight for wars, guard the frontier, and not raid Poland. The reality, it was a lot more fluid than that. Sometimes the Cossacks didn't get paid, they raid Poland anyways. Other times they were convinced they would just go off and sail down the Dnieper River into the Black Sea, and they were raiding, what's nowadays northern Turkey all the time. One good literary treatment of this is the book Taras Bulba, which is actually very, very good. There's a movie made about it too, I think about 50 years ago, which is pretty decent as well. So you have these kind of Cossacks who are outside of the Polish-Lithuanian authority, even though most of the kind of, what became the Ukrainian people, even though most of them probably considered themselves, Catholics or Orthodox rather than any ethnic label at the time, or Ruthenian if they did, outside of their authority. So we're in the 17th century, kind of like the 1640s, and all over the world, there's this horrible catastrophe. The climate had been cooling for a while, but during like kind of a 20-year period from 1640 to 1660, it was unusually bad. Um, there's all this chaos. You have the salt riots in Moscow. You have the Ottoman Empire has all of this unrest. The Ming Dynasty collapses and is overthrown by peasants, and then you have the Manchus who invade. Basically, everyone other than Japan suffers horribly in that 20-year period, and the Japanese were, just had a very, very good government for a long time. Eastern Europe was no exception to this. You have all of these people in Ukraine who are starving. Their harvests are dying off. Everyone's becoming impoverished, and there's more of a squeeze on the peoples of Ukraine than there, even normally was. The Poles were far from good rulers, even by the standards of the time, and the Poles had kind of worsened their problem by relying heavily on kind of Jewish managers to manage the Ukrainian populations. You had like 10% of landholders controlled like 80% of the land. So there's this extreme wealth inequality. You have these Cossacks who are beyond the authority of anyone, who are just kind of rampaging around, doing whatever they want to, and who are just looking for any excuse to raid Poland. The main thing, of course, though, is people are starving. They are more than willing to kill others to take their food so that they and theirs don't starve themselves. So there's this massive uprising, the Khmelnytsky uprising, and it's part of a broader period of Polish history called the Deluge. So the Poles have to deal with this massive Ukrainian uprising led by this guy called Bohdan Khmelnytsky, who was actually a veteran. He had fought for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in their wars with the Ottoman Empire and what's nowadays Moldova. I think he was married to a Moldovan woman. So he's not like the greatest example of Ukrainian nationalist figure, even though he is certainly viewed that way today. He did have extensive connections with the nobility. And as soon as he rebels, he actually takes Kiev with a relatively small army. And you just have this like explosion of rebellion. Like all these, Eastern Slavic Ukrainian people, they're rising up in rebellion. They're, murdering the Poles, murdering the Jews. I think something like 70-80% of the Jewish population was killed during this rebellion, as well as just tons and tons of Poles. You have all these Poles that are fleeing into, the Polish-controlled parts of the country, the fortresses, or Poland proper. And then on top of that, the Swedes see an opportunity to increase their influence and take even more of the Baltic trade ports. You see the Russians; they have an opportunity to swallow the what's called the left bank of Ukraine. For Ukraine, when you talk about the left bank, you mean they're looking south towards the Black Sea, so it's talking about the east of the Dnieper River. Whereas if you're talking about the right bank of Ukraine, again, you're looking south, so it's the western bank of the Dnieper River. Kiev is on the west bank of the Dnieper River, by the way, even though its suburbs now stretch into the well into the east with like Boris-Paul and all those places. So there's this horrible, horrible catastrophe. Poland gets invaded by everyone. War drags on for years and years. The Russians end up taking like huge territories in Belarus and eastern Ukraine. The Poles end up devastated. Like a third of their population dies. The Swedes become just filthy, filthy rich. They just gorge themselves on all this treasure. They bring it back to Sweden. It was a very, very successful war for the Swedes. They do very, very well. The whole country is just devastated. And now the Ukrainian rebels, they go and they initially try allying with the Crimean Tatars, and they're initially successful. The Crimean Tatars, they see an opportunity for, slave raiding and whatnot. I think they actually take some, Ukrainian slaves while they're allied with the Ukrainians during their uprising. But they're in it to break the power of Poland-Lithuania too. But then after this terrible battle, the Ukrainians lose a lot of their men, and the Crimean Tatars do too. So the Crimean Tatars eventually, kind of abandon them. The Turks and the Ottoman Empire, they go and they see an opportunity to extend their power as well and reach all the way up into Ukraine. They build a fortress in kind of the west that they hold briefly, but they don't last long. They had all these struggles with the Poles and Lithuanians too, and saw an opportunity to kind of break their power by backing the Ukrainians, and that was kind of what Bohdan Khmelnytsky, the leader of these Ukrainian rebels, saw an opportunity for. He wanted to build, if not win autonomy, and have kind of like a third power base for the Ukrainians within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And he was like, well, we could build like a whole empire. Like at one point, he wanted to include, he claimed like Belarus as well as parts of Poland as being the rightful territory of the Cossacks and Ukrainians and whatever. The names again were very, very fluid at this time, so it's hard to know what the the proper name to use for a lot of these peoples and states is. So in the end, the Ottoman Turks abandon the Ukrainians and Khmelnytsky. So Khmelnytsky goes and he sits down with the Tsar of Russia, and he signs this treaty in the 1650s, agreeing that they will basically be a Russian vassal state. And by then, Ukraine is just horribly suffering. Tons of people are starving. The Poles and Tatars and whatnot are rampaging around. So, with that, he's like, well, we'll get some protection from the, with force of Russian arms. The Russians, they set up some forts. I think Kharkov has like a Russian garrison established at that point, but it's really just kind of the northeastern part of what's nowadays Ukraine. They don't really extend their authority into the separatist regions at that point. Those were still very much you had a Turkish garrison right at the mouth of the Don River, as it flows into the Sea of Azov, and you have the wild fields, is what they were called. They were just so depopulated, barely anyone lives there, and it was just kind of fought over between rampaging bands of, the Cossacks, as well as the Crimean Tatars and whoever else was in the region. So the Russians, they don't really keep their part of the bargain. They establish the garrisons and, try to impose the taxation and whatnot. They try to bring the Cossacks on their orbit as well, with varying degrees of success. There's other Cossack bands that are, in Siberia and the North Caucasus and the Volga. We're mostly focused on the what's called the Zaporizhian host, the peoples by the rapids, of the Dnieper River. So where was I going with this? Let me just think for a second. Yeah, so there's some kind of minor rebellions of the Cossacks against the Russian administration and kind of the northeastern part of the country and what's nowadays Kharkov or Kharkiv Oblast within Ukraine. They're not particularly successful. The Russians just strengthen their hold of the region and gradually expand. So by the end of the 17th century, Ukraine is roughly divided into three. You have the Crimean Tatars, and who control the steppe. You have the Russians who control the northeast, and you have the Polish-Lithuanians who control the northwest of Ukraine. So then, by the time we get to the kind of 1690s, 1700s, we have a new Tsar in Russia, Peter the Great, one of the most important figures of all time. So he goes and he pursues a modernization campaign, again, to various degrees of success. He realizes that during his grand tour of Europe, how primitive Russia is in its manufacturers, and seeing the Netherlands, he realizes how important manufacturers are into creating a powerful and wealthy state. Better techniques in artillery and shipbuilding alone would give a substantial damage or advantage, to say nothing about improvements in literacy, and that kind of thing. At the same time, he also does kind of a cargo cult stuff that doesn't really matter for advancement of society, like shaving beards. He was really big into that, had a beer tax. or beard tax. Um, Interestingly enough, his mother, Natalia Norishkina, she was descended from in the male line at least, from a Tatar, kind of nomad who had gone to serve the Grand Dukes of Moscow in the 15th century. About a third of the nobility of Russia actually had Tatar roots at that point. Um, and later on it would be decreased because they'd have all of these noblemen who were descended from the Lithuanian noble families as well as some Polish noble families. But at that point, there was a very strong Tatar element within the Russian nobility. Because that was one of the ways that they would win over both the Tatars, kind of the late Middle Ages, in the early modern period, and would win a lot of Ukrainians over in the 18th century. They would give them extensive privileges. They would confirm their, within Moscow. They would recognize them as nobility. They would grant them lands, close to Moscow. They would train them in the best schools, later in St. Petersburg. Teach them how to speak proper Russian and whatnot, marry into the fine families, and maintain their class privileges and their traditional bases and homelands as well. So they very much like to co-opt elites and integrate them into the Muscovite ruling class. And the main thing was they had to become Orthodox Christian. That was the thing you had to do to become a true servant of the Tsar at that point. Very, very much a religious society. And the Orthodox Church's power was huge, even though Peter the Great would finally end its kind of parallel authority and put it underneath his authority to, a great deal of controversy. So Peter the Great, he goes and he very, very much wants to deal with the issues that the Tatars are causing and solve all those problems with the steppe. So he launches these two campaigns into the steppe to try to conquer kind of the mouth of the Don River. As he's doing this, he goes and there is a new king in Sweden who rises up. A very young guy, I think he's like 15 years old when he comes to the throne. And Peter the Great, he sees an opportunity because he wants to finally get access to the Baltic. The Russians have just been kind of wanting that access to the sea for a very, very long time. They hate being restricted to their inland, resources and taxes, and they know there's just so much wealth that they can get if they have access to the Baltic Sea. And they're completely right. At the time of the Napoleonic Wars, I think something like a third of Russian trade came through St. Petersburg, or a third of Russian tax revenue came from the trade in St. Petersburg. It was, absolutely enormous. Just access to the Baltic was so much more than anything else they could hope for at that time. So he really wants to go, and he wants to take the Swedish territories in Ingria and in Estonia and Latvia. I think in the beginning his plan was actually for Riga, modern-day capital of Latvia, to be the capital of Russia rather than St. Petersburg. But due to the long-lasting nature of the war, he ended up having to change it to St. Petersburg instead, which he founded. So he gets an alliance together. The Poles, the Danes, and the Russians, they all have their grievances against this very, very powerful Swedish government. So they form this grand coalition and are like, well, it's tiny Sweden with 1 million people. What could they possibly do? Well, a lot, as it turns out. The extreme militarization of the Swedish state had kind of reached its peak by that point. Their army is extremely, extremely capable. They overrun Denmark. They overrun Poland. And then the Russians, as they're trying to conquer Estonia by besieging a fortress, they're totally defeated, by this Swedish army. So the Russians retreat. They withdraw into kind of Russia proper. And the Swedes have to turn around, though, and focus on Poland, which is fighting this giant civil war. So, we talked earlier about how there are all the divisions within Poland. You have kind of the German-speaking Protestants who are, in Prussia and Pomerania. You have the Ukrainians who are still, a mixture. Some of them in the West are Catholic, some of them in the East are Orthodox. And then you have the, Poles who are divided between the Lithuanians, who still have their own like noble families, even if they speak Polish, as well as kind of rivalries within the kind of Polish nobility. You have like the lesser Polish nobility, the greater Polish nobility, and then you have all these kind of impoverished noblemen who have their own interests, and they have all these like horrible, horrible hatreds with each other. Poland-Lithuania had just been so powerful for so long. The nobles had had these great privileges. They hadn't been reined in. They'd been successful in defeating attempts at royal centralization. Like they had denied. Like at one point, the King of Poland was trying to create a like personal guard, and they limited him to like 800 men or something because they were worried that he would turn his guard into a personal army, which was completely legitimate. A couple other European states, like I think Denmark, did exactly just that. They, the king turned his personal guard into the army, and then was like, "Well, noblemen, guess what? I don't need you guys anymore. So bye." I think the Spanish had a similar thing. So, the Polish nobility saw all these trends of consolidation that really hurt the nobility and helped centralize royal authority in Europe in the 17th century, a lot of it which was due to the mass die-offs in that kind of 1640 to 1660 period with all the famines, and they didn't like it at all. So they actually were successful in preventing the consolidation of Polish authority, and had all of these feuds within themselves in what was, at least in theory, supposed to be a unitary state. So you have like a pro-Swedish faction that forms, and they're warring with this like Lithuanian faction, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth actually, like most of their fighting was done between like different factions amongst themselves, not between like Swedes and Russians or whatnot. Like there was one battle that involved something like 30,000 people in eastern Poland, and it was all just like the different noblemen from Lithuania fighting the the Poles from I think like northwestern Poland or something. They had all these disputes over like who would control what land, which noble privileges were correct, which ones weren't, just all sorts of just vicious hatreds. And it was vicious. I mean, like in a lot of Europe, like even in our own revolution, for instance, like most of the atrocities were committed, like when we would storm in and like find a bunch of loyalists to the British, maybe we'd like tar and feather them if they were poor, but if they were rich, we'd ransom them. Like George Washington having John André hanged was like unheard of because, John André was a nobleman and so was Washington, more or less. In Poland-Lithuania, that was only a couple decades before George Washington. The noblemen were not doing that. They were just like massacring each other and would just like assassinate each other, hack each other to death. Didn't even care about ransoms. There was just so little trust that they couldn't even like, they would just murder each other outright because they would suspect that people trying to pay ransoms were just setting up an ambush or something. So just a lot of internal divisions within Poland-Lithuania in that first 20 years of the 18th century that really set it up to be divided between the different powers. So the Swedes they spend all this time devastating Poland, kill a good chunk of the population again because there's just rampaging armies. They're foraging off the land, burning granaries, whatnot. And it actually makes it kind of difficult for the Swedes to campaign. So the Swedes end up having to go back. The king of Poland at that time was actually also the king of Saxony, which is it was a kingdom in Germany. Or not sure if it would have been a kingdom back then. I think it might have been a Dutch. Yeah, it was the Duchy of Saxony back then. It wouldn't become a kingdom for like another 120 years. So they go and they invade the Duchy of Saxony, which is a state south of modern day Berlin. South of Brandenburg, and they go and they build up this army there, and kind of the whole of Europe is waiting to see what the Swedes are going to do. There's, again, religious hatreds were extreme in Germany, the divide between the Catholics and the Protestants, and the Swedes were seen as kind of a potential Protestant ally, which could decisively intervene on either side of the ongoing War of Spanish Succession, where you have like Britain, Austria, all the different German states, the French were all involved in this very violent conflict over who would be the next king of Spain and who would dictate the balance of power in European politics. So all of them were kind of appealing to the King of Sweden to use his 20,000 Swedes and 20,000 Germans to intervene on their side, be the great Protestant champion or the balance against, the French, whatever their case was, they made it. But ultimately, he ignored them. He very much wanted to defeat the Danish, Polish-Russian alliance. So he rampaged back through Poland, and he decided to march on Moscow through Ukraine. The winter was very, very brutal. About half of his army froze to death. He expected he was going to get reinforcements from another Swedish army, which was marching from the Baltic states, I think like Latvia, down through like Belarus and Poland and into Ukraine, and they would meet up with each other to march on Moscow. However, that army, I think, got defeated or at least delayed by another Russian army. So he ended up marching through Ukraine. And he goes and he appeals to the Ukrainians and, they're kind of and the Cossacks to separate from the Russians and, again, be kind of an independent Swedish-aligned state. He'd played the divide and conquer very successfully within Poland, and he expected he was going to be able to do the same in Ukraine. He actually had some successes. There were a couple of thousand Ukrainians who ended up joining his army, but most Ukrainians... and at the same time, like Russia had issues too. There was like a rebellion, in the lower Volga and Astrakhan with like the, a class of soldiers that Peter the Great had sidelined and believed that he might be the Antichrist. There was it was a very, very tense situation. The Russians were by no means short of victory. So some Ukrainians went and decided to join the Swedes. Most, however, did decide to align with the Russians. Again, the ethnic identity wasn't as strong back then as it is now. Religion was very much the stronger force, so kind of that shared Orthodox faith drove most of the Ukrainians to be into the Russian side. The other aspect, too, was, Peter the Great. He was very, very merciless to the people who he thought would betray them, and as a matter of fact did. There was one guy, Ivan Mazepa, who was Ukrainian, and he wanted to raise a bunch more Ukrainians to fight against Peter the Great and, win kind of like independence for a new Ukrainian state that, he would presumably lead. But, he had his base like totally sacked by the Russians. Tons of his supporters got massacred. So he didn't have, as much support as he really expected to have, but still ended up joining the Swedes. So you have this kind of Swedish-German, army with some Ukrainian auxiliaries, and then you have this giant Russian army on the other side, which is a lot more Ukrainians. And they end up in a place called Poltava, which is in eastern Ukraine, a couple hundred kilometers west of the Donbass region, where all the fighting is. And there's this giant battle there, and Peter the Great's there. Karl the 12th, he's the king of Sweden. He's there, and they lead their armies. Karl the 12th, he gets wounded. I think he gets shot in the ankle or something the day before the battle during a skirmish, and so he's out of commission. He can't lead his soldiers, and as a result, it's his kind of three generals that end up leading the Swedish army. They have this giant battle, and the Swedes are they have like some initial successes, but their armies aren't coordinated well. One branch of the infantry ends up getting lost in the woods, and by the time they stumble back on the battlefield, the rest of the Swedish army has attacked this Russian army, which massively outnumbers it, and they're just totally and utterly defeated. So, in the end, I think Karl the 12th, he ends up escaping with 20 men or something like that to the Ottoman Empire. Peter the Great pursues them, and Peter the Great actually loses a battle to the Ottoman Turks and has to finagle himself out with, giving up his territories he conquered on the Don River, which is kind of in the far southwest of Russia, right by the Ukrainian border, back to the Ottomans in return for his freedom. So the war continues on for a while longer, but there's just only 1 million people in Sweden. So whereas the Russians can keep on just drawing up more and more conscripts from wherever, the Swedes are running out of men. They're at the point where it's just kind of young men or young boys and old men who are staffing their armies by the late 17 teens. The Polish nobility, they're really unhappy because Peter the Great starts sending the Cossacks and sea raiders to plunder the Swedish coast. And the Swedes are like, we can't put up with our king anymore, and they assassinate him and set up I think it's a sister on the throne, who of course makes peace with the Russians. The Swedes give up their, control of the, what's nowadays it's called Ingria, Leningrad Oblast, kind of metro area of St. Petersburg, as well as a lot of other territories to the Russians and the Poles. And I think the Danes get something. I think they might get their sound tools back, but only for the Swedish ships and not for the Russian or Polish ships. So that's kind of the end of the Northern War. Sweden does try to become a great power again for the next 100 years, but it just doesn't work out for them. The Ukrainians at that time, of course, they're dominated by the Russians. The Russians control most of Ukraine by this point, although the Crimean Tatars still rule the steppe for another 50 years. So that, and that's also the point when you start to see, the Ukrainian nobility had been being integrated with the Russians even in the 1600s. There is one theory, in particular, the religious, like a lot of religious figures within Russia did come from Ukraine and kind of like the Kiev area. So you have this kind of Ukrainization of Russia that's going on between, those wars in the middle of the 17th century and like the 1648 to 1656, I believe it was, all the way into Peter the Great's time. So that lasted like an hour 45 minutes, a lot longer than I thought it would. So next week we will be